Hello, welcome to this edition of the Jewish Contrarians podcast. I'm here with my partner in thought crime, Brandy Shofutinsky. Hi, Brandy.
Hey, David.
We are here today to sort of depart from our usual themes around the American culture wars and turning our ire to the Israeli culture wars. And Brandy and I might have different takes here. So we're accustomed to disagreeing agreeably or maybe even agreeing disagreeably. I'm not sure which. But today we'll see where we go. So I'm going to start with one of my rants here, Brandy. And again, you'll tell me why I'm off base. I've been obviously paying attention to what's happening in Israel. Like many people, I was very concerned when this very extreme government came into power and tried to impose sort of judicial reform, among other things. And I worried that they were going to undercut the Israeli courts and that Israel would lose sort of its liberal democracy in the process, that Israel would have sort of a populist democracy, and that would run roughshod over the minority rights. And also, and I think this is still something I'm concerned about, is if that were the case, it would sort of scare away Israeli elites and secular people who are the backbone of much of the Israeli economy, and many of them might leave the country. That's not the Israel that they grew up in or want. I was also worried about some of the rhetoric that was coming from the extremists in the government, Ben Gvir and Smotrich and others, who talked as if they had won this decisive victory in Israel that was going to lead to sort of a fundamentally rebalancing of power in Israeli society, which seems scary and violative of the fundamental social contract in the country, which requires a great deal of collaboration and understanding, even if there are differences in policy. So that's what I came in with. But I have to say, and we just got back from Israel. I should say that we just got back from Israel. We spent a great week with a multi-ethnic delegation of folks who share with us a lot of our perspectives on the state of liberalism and ideology in America. These are Black, Jewish, Asian, Muslim, Latino, and we had a wonderful trip, sort of looking at Israel. This was my third trip in 6 months to Israel, so I've spent some time there. Brandy, you have an apartment there. You have two sons there, so you spend time there. You've been spending summers there, so it's not like we're strangers to Israel. I've probably been 60 to 70 times. I follow it closely. I've been in the Israel advocacy community my whole life, so I don't want you to think we're just parachuting in and coming out with perspectives. I think our perspectives are a little bit more informed by that, informed by conversations with very big thinkers in Israel as well. So here's my take, that there's a bit of crying wolf on the part of Israeli secular thinkers and people that I listen to, I trust. There was this article by Daniel Gordis, Yossi Klein Halevi, and Moti Friedman that argued that Israel really could be on the brink. This is before sort of the protests ended the stalemate to a degree, and now it looks like Israel's not going to go full throttle ahead on judicial reform. That said, I looked at Israeli society. I see a thriving society, not only economically, but even socially to a degree. There's still a very palpable sense of identity in Israel that I think that's missing now from the American conversation and narrative. I think that as much as Israelis are disagreeing over the future of the country and the nature of its democracy, many Israelis in a fundamental sense are still deeply bought in. And that's why the protests in Israel not only lacked violence, but there were Israeli flags everywhere. It was an outpouring of patriotism. So it was a sort of a moment of pride in that sense. So that's sort of number one. The second thing is, I did have some appreciation for this, but I think I appreciated it more during and after our trip, was that there really is a legitimate gripe about judicial reform. It's not just a bunch of right-wing fanatics trying to undercut democracy. The Israeli Supreme Court had really taken on a great deal of power, and it's not elected. It's sort of self-appointing. So it doesn't, like the U.S. Supreme Court, come out of our legislative bodies. It's just sort of self-perpetuating. There are all these legal advocates that are associated with them that have decision-making power, and it constitutes a system of elites that can easily run amok and actually subvert the democratic process. So I think there's a legitimate case for judicial reform. And many Israelis are now saying that that who are opposed to what was happening, that yeah, of course we need judicial reform, but they weren't saying that 6 months ago. And there are many, of course, now the people who are pushing the judicial reform said, of course we need compromise, but they weren't saying that a few months ago. So I find that the country probably is going to solve the issue of judicial reform. And one last thing before I end this rant, I've seen a number of these sort of panics in Israel in the past few years, where people projected with great sadness that Israel was on the brink, that Israel was going to lose its democratic character. So you had the nation state law, and it passed, but not nearly as egregiously as we thought. There was a debate about whether Israel should annex the West Bank, and it was never going to annex all of the West Bank. It was going to probably annex like 10%, but that actually didn't materialize because of the Abraham Accords. And there were, before that, there was the issue of sort of African emigres from Eritrea and other places that Israel was going to expel. That didn't actually happen in the way that that people predicted, the dire manner people predicted. So we've seen these sort of catastrophes, impending catastrophes, sort of come and go and not lead to the kind of catastrophe that people predicted. So I have a little skepticism in me, Brandy, about saying that Israeli society is failing. Do you think Israel's society is really on the brink? What did you come away with?
So I want to start by saying that I think that I'm not as optimistic about it as you are, and not for the same reasons as the judicial reform. So first of all, I wasn't, hair on fire, screaming and concerned with the election of, this conservative government, simply probably because Israel's had so many elections over the past couple of years. I'm expecting there to be another one soon anyway. Whether I'm right or wrong, that's just been a feeling. My concern with Israel as a democracy is more regarding its internal structure versus external threats. I think that what would cause Israel to be on the brink actually has nothing to do with the judicial reform and more has to do with political math. It's demographics. Yeah, it's a vibrant democracy. You see protests that aren't violent. You see protests where you don't know if they're pro-judicial reform or against it because everyone's waving the same Israel flag and coming out in the spirit of patriotism and being proud Israelis. They're not calling for the destruction of the country in which they live. To me, that's democracy in action. That's a beautiful thing. I think that the voices of the people will be heard and have been heard. I'm more concerned with the budget there that's making its way through the Knesset right now. That, in my opinion, causes more of a threat to Israel than any judicial reform or election of a far right or, not that it's possible, but a far left government. And I think that when people even here in the diaspora started protesting about the judicial reform and really expressing concern, one thing that struck me is their concerns weren't regarding what was happening internally to the country. So they didn't express concern that how would this judicial reform affect Israelis on the ground, their ability to afford housing, their ability to send their kids to quality schools, their ability to afford groceries. They were concerned with how it was going to impact Israel on the geopolitical stage. And I have zero concern about that part.
Right. So you said that you're concerned about the political demography. What do you think is going to happen? What is the potential impending disaster or far-reach long-term disaster that you're worried about?
There are two things. The first one being economically, in order to not foment brain drain, which is very possible in a country with highly skilled young people, that if they're unable to make it within the country, they can take their skills elsewhere. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that already in Israeli society. 5-10 years from now, that's not going to be a good thing for the demographics within Israel. The other part is a more controversial conversation because it devolves into this identity politics argument. And I don't mean it in any way, shape, or form this way, but you have two populations within Israel that are growing and that aren't able to or willing to participate in the creation and making of a national identity. And that's the ultra-Orthodox population and the Israeli Arab population, where they go to separate schools. So there isn't the creation of this national identity by them, by children going through the same public school system. And They highly, not all, but highly do not serve in the IDF, which is another opportunity to kind of forge national identity. So you have two nations within a nation that are growing in population, their demographics are growing, and their contributions back to the state either are ignored or underappreciated, or they just don't make it. So when you look at, okay, 10 years from now, what's the population going to look like? Are you having enough people that are joining together to forge this national identity? Or are you having nations within a nation inside of Israel that can kind of tear down that structure of national identity?
Yeah. So I've been coming to Israel since I was 18. That in 1985, I spent a year at Hebrew University. So forgive me about the sort of Israeli who cried wolf mentality that have. I've been hearing that the ultra-Orthodox population in the Israeli Arab population is going to overtake Israeli national identity for 38 years.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying that there's no threat. I mean, I think a few years ago, I heard that the Haredi population was 8% in Israel. Now that I'm hearing the number 10%. Obviously, that's growth. By the way, the Israeli secular population is one of the few secular populations in the world that is actually growing in numbers. The Israelis are having 3 kids per family, which is amazing. And so, yes, I mean these are problems that I worry about. These are, but they've been around a long time.
They have,
And
but I want to say I don't mean that they're going to overtake it and oh my goodness, to play kind of a game on depopulation or repopulation. I'm talking about numbers where if you have 20 or 30% of your population that is disenfranchised or is not participating, what does that look like economically? So even though secular Israelis are having a lot more kids than in other secular countries, how many of those kids will also grow into adults that will stay in Israel and contribute to the national identity, to the national economics, versus how many will leave and it'll lead to some kind of brain drain because they're feeling the economic pressure that this government, current government, that their budget is placing on these people.
right. This government may be short-lived as well, so I don't think we can assume that there's a straight line going forward. That you might have a bad budget, and you might end up having a bad budget for a year or 6 months or maybe 2 years, but at some point, there's some restoration of sanity in Israel on these issues. I mean, I don't think it's a particularly popular government. I think all the polls are showing that this government is not very popular, and if the elections were held today, there'd be a very different outcome. So that again, like that's I know I'm playing the role of glass half full here, and I don't know. The other thing is I've been a bit skeptical of the demographics or destiny argument precisely because I've seen it not materialize. We talked a lot about that, about, sort of if Israel didn't cut a peace deal and create a 2-state solution, Israel would be overtaken. The numbers in between the Mediterranean and the Jordan would be so out of whack that Israel would become, I guess, somehow an apartheid state. That was the argument. Well, first came the 1 million Soviet Jews into Israel, which saved that. Then Israel unloaded the Gaza Strip. So Israel no longer controls 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. People act as if they're still occupying the Gaza Strip. So they still throw in those 2 million people as if Israel's occupying them, and that somehow constitutes some kind of moral problem. Even though, obviously the Gaza is not the best place in the world to be, but it's not Israel's problem, certainly not alone. And yes, of course, you have the West Bank. But again, like demographics or destiny, that seemed to fade away, rapidly. I've heard those arguments applied in the American scene as well. Like, okay, America is going to be a permanent Democratic Party enclave because of the majorities of immigrants. At 2043, America will be a majority non-white. And of course, none of that makes any sense at all because, of course, immigrants are voting for both parties and not just voting for Democrats as people thought they would. So all these things can shift very easily and are hard to predict. So it's not that I don't take them seriously. I do. And I worry about the same things you're worried about. But I don't know. I mean, Israel, like if I did the demographic math, and now I fast forward to where we are now, and Israel has a higher gross domestic product than Japan and the UK. and I say, okay, well, what makes me think that in 10 years when we're doing a Jewish Contrarians podcast and we're looking at the numbers, we're like, oh my God, look at where Israel's now. I mean, I don't know. It could go either way. So I'm a little skeptical.
No, I'm not predicting that the demographics are going to be on a straight line and it's going to lead to doom and destruction. What I am saying is that I believe that the government should take more responsibility for forging national identity. Many people know already, one of the places that happens is in public school system. They have a fractured education system. I think that that's not the path I would take if I were looking to address concerns, whether demographic, economic, and the idea of forging one national identity for all citizens of the state. And I think that it's been relatively easy for not just this government, but all of the preceding ones to keep that system fractured for stability's sake, versus actually taking kind of a bold and brave step to create some sort of system where all Israelis are able to come together and forge that identity. And we met two young men, two young Israeli Arab men who expressed a desire to do that, to participate in the creation of a national identity. And unfortunately, it seems as though identity politics is kind of trumping the idea of government leaders leading in that position.
Yeah, it would be really nice if there were an option for Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews to go to the same high schools and get to know each other. And their programs are soccer leagues and things like that, coexistence projects and the like, but they're not the same as going to school. I think that the Israeli system probably can't change in that way. I know maybe I'm sounding like the kind of Israeli leader that you're critiquing, but I just don't. I think that wouldn't work in Israel, because I think that it is a different national population. I don't think that the integration process has ever really been about Israeli Arabs, but rather making sure that Israeli Arabs have equal access to services and so forth, because I just think that it would cause mass resentment and conflict. It's not like managing diversity in a country like America. We're dealing with very different populations that have been at war with each other from at times. So I don't know. I'm not as yeah.
I half agree with you on that, but the issue isn't just affecting Israeli Arabs, it's affecting multiple segments of the Israeli Jewish population. You have multiple school systems. You have people who live in the periphery versus people who live in the center, who have access to vastly different resources when you look at education and schooling and job opportunities. That is something that the government, if they're elected officials, that's part of their responsibility.
Right.
You can't have a school system where children aren't learning the basics.
Right. Well, that they should do. I just don't know that it should be an integrated school system between Jews and Arabs.
Not necessarily. I don't think that that is necessary in order to forge a national identity. You also are living in a country where certain segments of the student population don't learn the Hebrew. I mean, it's a system where it's setting up certain segments of the population to fail.
Right. And you can also try to make sure Israelis are more devoted to learning Arabic and the like, so that there can be more interchange between the populations. I think that the project to try to raise the level of commitment of Israeli Arabs is a very important project. I would spend a lot more time on that than I would be worrying about Palestinians in the West Bank, where I don't think that there's any easy solution to. I hate to say it. I'm somebody who's advocated for two-state solution my entire life, but I look around and I'm thinking, I don't see a lot of opportunity for that anytime soon, if ever. But I do think that Israel can do a lot with its Israeli Arab population. We just took this trip. Maybe we can change topics for a second. We just took this trip of multi-ethnic leaders. These are leaders that we are working with to forge a new coalition on issues like ethnic studies. We're trying to fight the radical ethnic studies that's appearing in school systems throughout California and now in different parts of the country. You've been really on the front lines of this battle, and JILV, Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, is really playing a leading role now in bringing people together, Chinese Americans, Indian Americans, Muslims, African Americans, and the like, who are horrified about what they're seeing. And so that's one of our main mission areas right now. And yes, thank you, Dan, for putting up that photo. This was in photos. This was a great group. And I've been taking groups to Israel for a long time, and most of them are sort of progressives who might come in with a bit of hostility even toward Israel, or severe criticism of Israel. And we had none of that on this trip. I mean, not that we chose people based on their views of Israel, but these are people who are very critical already of what's happening in American society with the education system. So they're much more likely to, support Israel and think that Israel is a fine country. They're probably people who see the nexus between these sort of hyper woke forces in schools as well as the BDS movement and the like. So they're going to be naturally opposed to that. What did you make of that whole experience? I'll shut up.
I think that the group we took was fantastic. I think that it was fascinating because we had a lot of different political and ideological opinions in one group, and to be able to sit together, to eat together, to travel all over Israel together and have conversations that were deep and meaningful, mostly about, or my take from it is mostly about what it means to have a democracy. So when we talk about civil liberties and freedom of speech and identity politics, a lot of that was really rooted, how my takeaway is that it was rooted in what a democracy looks like. And it looks like the group we took, very different viewpoints, different political ideas, but still able to stand together and have a really meaningful conversations, even when we disagreed. It was a great group.
Right. If you're seeing the video version of this and you saw the photos that Dan put up, you would have seen a banner that said Sharaka. Sharaka was our partnership organization in Israel. Sharaka is a partnership between Israel and the Gulf countries that are supporting the Abraham Accords. And these were our partners in Israel who helped us bring this great delegation to Israel. We really appreciated that partnership and look forward to doing other missions in the future with them. It was really an amazing trip. Also, when you have people who are intellectual critics of the current ideological vibe in the U.S., those are people who have strong critical thinking skills. So they're able to easily make sense of the situation in Israel. So when they hear about judicial reform, they have all the right questions, all the right critical thinking skills to be able to make sense of it. That is also a pleasure. That doesn't always happen when you just bring in, an activist group to Israel. So it was nice to be in conversation with people like that, and to have them sort of have our group gel and become the kind of coalition that once it's back in the United States is going to fight against the extremist forces on the American front.
I agree. I think one of the other takeaways I had from the trip is, in the group, is that the questions that they asked were so meaningful, but it also led me down to question myself, like, okay, there's more that we need to do kind of on the forefront to address these questions before they're asked. And we need to do more, I think, as regarding Israel, regarding the Jewish people. We need to be able to speak more to who we are as a people, what Israel means as a democracy, kind of to counter a lot of the misinformation that's out in the public sphere.
Yeah. So before we end, I think it would be good to do a little update on ethnic studies. We've had podcasts on ethnic studies. People who listen to this podcast and get our emails, if you're not on our email list, please email us at info@jilv.org. So we get you on the email list. Our work on ethnic studies is really coming to a head in many places. The school year is almost over, but next school year, I think, is going to be a critical period of time. What are you seeing in California and elsewhere with ethnic studies?
A lot of things that are a cause for concern, but I'm also seeing a lot of people come together and actually realize that if we're going to have our voices heard, that we have to be able to speak out. Because if there isn't a counter narrative, then the current narrative that supports radical ethnic studies will be the only one that's heard, and that's what education leaders will think is the right thing to do. So I think that there's still a whole lot of work to be done, and I see people coming together to do that, to talk about. Of course, we want to teach students about all of the variety of people that make up our country and our nation and the world we live in, and explain things. And the way to do that does not have to be divisive. It doesn't have to be partisan. So I'm hoping to see more of us come together and build our coalition even bigger and stronger.
Yeah, one of the things that we're working on is developing a teacher training and curriculum institute to train teachers in an alternative model of ethnic studies, one that's not ideological, one that's not indoctrinating. And Brandy, is leading efforts there and is already going to be doing some training, which shows you that there's demand for this. So I think we're going to be at the forefront of this. One of the reasons, quite frankly, besides that, it's really important, and if this ethnic studies curriculum continues to spread around the country and is integrated in the larger social studies curricula of schools across the country, we're going to really face some dire consequences down the line. The other reason is for us, we're able to show the Jewish community something very tangible, how this ideology, if it takes hold, how it can actually harm our own interests. It's sort of exhibit A in the fight against radical ideology on the left, and we're not going to let up on this. This is going to be a major effort on our part to try to move the conversation in the other direction. And in the meantime, be in discussion with the Jewish leadership around this, so that they don't just remain sort of weak-kneed on these issues of ethnic studies. And a lot of them, their core instinct is to sort of just amend it on the margins so that it doesn't explicitly target Jews, but you end up with an ideology in place that is going to lead to targeting Jews in Israel. Even if you don't name Israel as a settler colonial state, but you still talk about America as a settler colonial state, and you talk about settler colonialism as if it's the only way of looking at the world, you're going to end up with Israel being viewed as a settler colonial state. And I think our Jewish organizations are lacking in imagination or nerve to fight this, and our goal is to help. I mean, we don't have to do all the fighting. We don't need to be on the front lines all the time. I mean, we have other work to do. So I would love it if some of these organizations stepped up to the plate and took a strong stance for American values and for the American democratic values and free speech and free expression of ideas and oppose indoctrination. And unfortunately, I haven't seen enough of that. I think certain organizations like the American Jewish Committee are on the right track, but I'd like to see a lot more leadership coming from mainstream Jewish organizations on this.
I would too, and I also hope that those organizations kind of follow our lead and listen to voices from other communities, other non-Jewish communities that also don't want our children kind of as test case for what happens when kids are steeped in radical ideology. I think that has a negative impact on all communities, including non-Jewish communities. Unfortunately, I think a lot of organizations are hearing one perspective that really represents a small fringe minority and thinking that, okay, that makes them hesitate to speak out, that we can't do that. And I just hope that they understand that that's not the case, and maybe follow our lead a little bit and listen to a bigger diversity of voices.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're really trying to do is make sure that Jewish organizations understand that there is an alternative coalition out there. We're building it, but they can build it. They don't have to rely on us. They can go out there. There are ethnic leaders in every single one of these ethnic communities who are horrified at what's happening. They don't want their kids indoctrinated in this ideology. They're new to the scene because this hasn't been the set of threats that they faced, but they're getting it, and many of them are coming out. So let's help lead and shape that effort rather than wait for it to materialize. That's what's happening right now, and I think we have a really important role to play in that. We are going to fight the good fight on ethnic studies and radicalism in K through 12 schools. And we appreciate all your support. And if you know others who think that this work is important and want to be supportive in any way that they can, please let us know. Again, you can find me at david@jilv.org or brandy@jilv.org. We're here to get your ideas. So thank you very much. And until next time.
Thanks, David.